Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sandip Chandarana, Director of Professional Underwriters Agency. I also have Bruce Furukawa of Furukawa Castles LLP here. We want to thank everyone for joining us today and spending their valuable time with us. We really appreciate it. We're grateful to have Bruce here today to present on the topic of the Champlain Towers collapse of 2021. I'll be turning it over to him shortly. We're really excited about this topic. I think it's a great topic that's been in the news and everyone knows about it. I was even telling my wife about it this morning and she said, wow, you'll have to fill me in on the details of it. So we're excited. This webinar is a team effort. It's done in conjunction with us, PUA. We're the underwriting agency that represents Arch Insurance Company, who's sponsoring this webinar. Arch is an A+15 admitted carrier in the architects and engineers space, and we very much appreciate them putting this webinar on for us. Let's quickly review a couple of the housekeeping matters here. So everyone will be muted during the presentation. If you have any questions, please type them into the questions box, and we'll, at certain junctures of this presentation, we'll stop and answer those questions. We're also recording this webinar, so we'll be sending up a follow-up email, and so you'll get not only the PowerPoint, but you'll get a recording of the webinar itself. Let's go on to the next slide. So as far as CE credits, so 1 hour of continuing education credit will be given to all licensed architects and engineers that are attending this webinar. Unfortunately, the CE credits are not available for insurance agents. I know we've got a good mix of architects and engineers as well as insurance agents on this, but the CE is only available for licensed A&Es. You'll be provided with a written certificate of attendance that can be submitted to your state. To obtain the certificate of attendance, please email Liz Seaman at eseaman@nsminc.com, and we'll be providing that information later as well. So a little bit more about Bruce Furukawa. He is the founder, one of the founding partners at Furukawa Castles LLP. He's been defending design professionals for over 30+ years. While his main practice is design professionals, he's also represented real estate brokers, accountants, contractors, as well as owners in a wide range of projects. He's an experienced trial attorney. He's litigated complex construction delay and cost claims, construction defects, land use, and personal injury lawsuits. Bottom line, Bruce is a true expert in the field, and we're lucky to have him with us today.
Thank you.
As far as the agenda, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I want to save more time for Bruce, but we're going to be talking about all aspects of the Champlain Towers collapse, including the litigation and settlement and insurance ramifications. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about PUA. We were formed in 1990. We've got a stability or a track record of stability and returning underwriting profits for our underwriting carriers or for our carrier partners. We write about $65 million in gross written premium, and we insure over 1,500 insureds. We specialize in 4 lines of insurance, so architects and engineers, professional liability, design build contractors, miscellaneous professional liability, and then we also write excess limits in those 3 lines of business. Really what we're all about is our strong paper and broad coverage. Again, we've got Arch Insurance Company as our admitted carrier, and we also have Lloyd's on an E&S basis. We also have our PUA Market Solutions where we represent several other companies. But the bottom line is we can assist you in navigating the most difficult and complex risks and issues. And we also want to point you towards our webinar, www.puainc.com. It's brand new, and we recently added a PUA University tab onto it that has all our old webinars and a lot of risk management material. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bruce, and we can get started on this. Oh, I'm sorry, one more. So to join our webinar mailing list, You can sign up to receive email invitations to join our quarterly webinars as well as newsletters, etc. Go to our website, puainc.com. We've got 3 more webinars slated for this year: June 6th, August 21st, and November 6th. And all that information will be available on our website. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Bruce.
Thank you, Sandip. Today we're going to go through, we have some learning objectives that we're going to go through today. First, we're going to examine the timeline of events on the day of the Champlain Towers collapse. During the course of the discussion, I'm going to identify the issues from the preliminary forensic analysis of the building design, construction, and maintenance history that needed to be evaluated in the events leading up to and including the collapse. We're also going to understand the professional responsibility of design professionals, inspection authorities having jurisdiction, contractors and building owners and operators in the design, construction, inspection, and maintenance of buildings. And then we're going to discuss how the Champlain Towers collapse and past building disasters basically helped our understanding of how design professionals have a duty to warn. And in this case, we're going to go through what happened and talk about the duty to warn in this for this project. I think you'll find, once we go through the history, there was a lot of instances where there are indications of some potential problems the building, but the duty to warn, I think, was met, and there was not an apparent immediate imminent harm that would require any additional sort of duties to warn. But we'll go through that, going through the mechanism, the collapse, and also just some of the history. Next slide, please. So this is the building. It was designed in 1979. It's a cast-in-place concrete structure. It was actually constructed in 1981, and the collapse occurred on June 24th, 2021, and it was coming up on its 40-year recertification. It's a 12-story building. It also has a penthouse, which is it's not that significant that there's a penthouse, but that is one of the differences between this building and a what we call a sister building, which I'll show you a picture of later on in the presentation. This is a 136-unit residential condominium building. There's a 1-story below grade parking garage. At the at grade entrance, there's a pool and a rec area. In 1996, there's an installation of planters and tile on the roof pool deck. Sorry, on the pool deck, and that's significant because this added a significant amount of weight to the pool deck that was not a part of the original design and in the original calculations for the building's pool deck. I mentioned there was a 40-year recertification that was required in 2021. The process was initiated in 2018 by a consultant who prepared a report and found quite a few issues with the building, provided what I believe to be sufficient warnings, and the process of repairs were started. The process was sort of started and stalled, and there was problems with putting in some of the waterproofing for the pool. Ultimately, there was a $15 million rehab design project that was started in 2020, a year before the collapse. But it did not really effectuate repairs to the columns, which we'll talk about in the garage, that appear to be where the collapse began. I mentioned earlier that the collapse did occur on June 24th, 2021. The timing of it is unfortunately it was at 1:24 a.m. in the morning, and quite a few things occurred in this very short time period, about 1 a.m. to 1:24 a.m. The building was eventually actually imploded, and only 10 days later, after they had tried to rescue as many people as they could, and they were able to remove the bodies of what ended up being 98 people who lost their lives that day. You can change, next slide, please. This, well, go back one slide. This is the building with the pool. The other picture didn't really show the pool, but you can see the pool deck to the left. And to the far left, you can see a new structure that was built. It started in 2016. And the significance of this structure next door will be understood later, but there was an allegation that the construction of the building next door by the installation of sheet piles caused vibrations that were and could affect the building, the Champlain Towers south. And that was actually never proven. There was no final reports or anything that was indicating that that was the case, but that was one of the theories of the collapse, cause of the collapse was the construction of that building next door. Next slide, please. The interesting thing about this project is that it was built in 1981, and there was a sister building built in 1982 called the Champlain Tower North. And there was also another building built in 1994 called the Champlain Tower East, which is in between the two buildings. The 1982 Champlain Tower North building, it's very similar. You can see the footprint in the top right of my slide. The South Tower, which did collapse, has a little bit longer sort of area heading towards the ocean. But it's interesting that there was a building that was constructed very similar time, and to this day has not had any significant problems. As far as I know, and I checked even as recently as last week, the building has been found to be structurally sound. Everybody lives there. There's been no indication of any problems with the building, and it's being used today. So you know, it's like it's interesting because you have like sort of a prototype. You know, you could have two buildings basically placed in the same place, and yet one building collapsed and the other building is standing strong. So what were the differences? And we can take a look at some of those. Next slide, please. So this is the building. There was basically a west tower and an east tower and the pool deck. The collapse you'll see occurred primarily in the area right where the pool deck is, and then the collapse occurred in the center between the west and the east towers. Eventually, the east tower collapsed sort of minutes later after the initial collapse. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through the information that we received through video. There was a security camera next door, which actually has the footage of the actual collapse. And there's the video. We took some video clips of it, so you could see sort of the mechanism. But essentially, the first part where you see number one, that's where the collapse sort of began. You can see that in the second section in the back collapsed next, and then finally the third section of the east tower collapsed on top of the section that first collapsed. So that was sort of the sequence of events with the collapse, and we're going to move to the next slide. This is the slide that basically shows a model that was done, and when we were presenting these when I presented this before, we basically indicated the location of people who were actual witnesses who contacted the security desk and indicated to the security consultant or security guard that they heard some construction. They were concerned about it. They thought maybe they heard some loud noises, felt vibrations, and this occurred, of course, at 1 in the morning. The collapse, of course, happened at 1:24 a.m. So we have a point now where at 1 a.m. in the morning, people are feeling something is going on. There was we'll show another video or a picture of a person was walking their dog at like 1 in the morning and actually saw something, which I'll show you in the next picture. But these witnesses are very important to the forensic people who were trying to determine the cause and what happened. And basically, the residents from room 111 actually, unfortunately, left their unit and moved to the security desk. You can go to the next slide. The collapse, we understand, occurred right almost below room 111. And there was also a condo camera in room 711 and 611, which we were able to have the video for. You can see the video pictures in the room 711 in the top right. And this is approximately at 1:15 a.m. This is 7 minutes, I think 7 minutes before the actual collapse. So you can see that things are starting to move and rumble and change. And there were people who were obviously concerned. So can we go to the next slide? When the collapse occurs at 1:22 a.m., we talked about it, it collapsed from the center. The pool deck had already actually collapsed first, and then the rest of the building sort of went down afterwards. Can we go to the next slide? And the section in the back goes down, and then next slide, the east tower then collapses. This is an elapsed time of like 12 seconds, I believe. So this is what it looked like sort of the next day. Then next slide. So when we looked at the building structurally, we noticed that there were two shear walls. The shear wall on the left side of the building obviously is much more significant and substantial. It is probably the main reason why the west tower did not collapse during the collapse of the east tower. And you'll see from the next photos, we'll show you where we think the collapse actually occurred. The witnesses found that the initial failure zone was on the pool deck. And we have some interesting photos. If we go to the next photo. So this is a diagram of the building underneath the parking garage. And from all the photographic evidence and everything, we determined that this column M1 1.1 was probably the initial column that failed. And from there, it actually took the rest of the building sort of down. And if we go to the next slide, this is the parking garage from the street. And this is where the tourist basically films at about 1 a.m. So 7 minutes prior to the building collapse. A person walking the dog took an actual photograph and video of some construction debris, and they also heard some loud noises in this area. So we can go to the next picture. This is actually an interesting photo because this is a photo of the Champlain Towers South entry, obviously before the collapse. But this picture sort of tells you and shows you where the tourist was located on the left, taking the picture. And then you can see the 3 or 4 columns that I was talking about earlier. The one on the far right, M11.1, this is the one where we believe the tourist film shows it collapsed just before the collapse of the building. So if we go to the next slide, and this is another view from going down the ramp, you can see the column again on the left side, M11.1, which is the one we think is the one that collapsed first. And then this is all under the pool deck. So pool deck is just right above this location here. So you can go to the next slide. This is the video. This is the video by the tourist, and you can see that there's already. This is 7 minutes prior to the total collapse. You can see that there's possibly a planter from the pool deck that actually dropped down to the garage level, and that there's a ruptured sprinkler or irrigation pipe that's already there present. And this is 7 minutes prior to the total collapse. You can go to the next slide. So this is a picture, actually, the top one, and I talked about the Champlain Tower North being a sister. So this picture on the top is actually from the Champlain Tower North garage entry. And you can see how similar it is to the Champlain Tower South, where the collapse occurred, by the fact that they actually have the same exact columns in the very same locations. In this picture that you see on the bottom, you can see this is the picture video taken by the tourist. You can see that the M11.1 column is missing, and that there's rubble from construction or concrete rubble in the bottom right, and possibly the column itself has collapsed and is sort of on the floor there. So this is where the mechanism of the collapse sort of began, and these photos actually were very helpful in determining that, especially with the location of the and missing location of the column there. We can go to the next slide. So as talked about before, the M11.1 column dropped first, and then from there it's sort of created this sort of a domino effect where the loads basically proceeded to go down, and the building then collapsed on that side by the pool deck. You can go to the next slide. So after a major collapse like this, there's an organization called NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They came in immediately, and they were working on a report to analyze the failure and to perform invasive testings. They look at it from a number of different perspectives. They obtained the data, and they look back at the building history. What were the codes? They look at the evidence that was there at the site. They obviously they were taking video. They had the videos of the neighboring property and the tourists, which certainly helped them make their determinations. And from this, they perform an analysis and a report. And the report actually has come out, and a lot of the things that I'm talking about were found to be, where the collapse occurred and how the collapse occurred. We're going to get into that next in the next slide. So you can move to the next slide. So they were investigating almost 24 different possible causes. I talked about some of the causes in my initial discussion, which is like the neighboring property, the installation of the sheet piles was one. There was the corrosion of the rebar caused by the pool deck, the pool leaking, and there was also the added weight of the planters to the pool deck. There was a number of other hypotheses, and there was some final sort of findings, but I'd like to kind of take you through sort of the after during the investigation of some of the photographs that were taken by the various. Some of them are from news reports, some of them are from other forensic engineers, but we can take a look at that next. So next slide. This picture basically shows where the the collapse actually occurred. You can see that the whole deck basically ended up in the garage down below. And one of the things that was most significantly noted in these photographs was the fact that most of the garage columns had actually punched through the pool deck. And when they looked at the some of these columns and the connections to the pool deck, they found the rebar was not very significant. And the other note was that there may be missing rebar in the slab itself. So there was a sort of concern that and I think that ultimately there was a finding that the original design for the building was inadequate for the pool deck slab and the rebar for the columns connecting to the slab. And like I said, this building was designed in 1980, built in 1981.
Hey, Bruce, while I have you here, let's take, we have a question that's come in. So Bobak asked, if the water is from a ruptured sprinkler line, did the fire alarm trip? This should have been a signal or a serious problem and initiated a building evacuation. Any comments on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And if it was a sprinkler, if it was a fire sprinkler, you're right. I think there would have been an indication of a fire alarm triggering. I'll probably talk about this a little bit later. When we get into the settlement and the final sort of resolution, you'll see where this becomes an interesting topic of discussion. I'm assuming and I'm thinking that it may not have been a sprinkler line because I don't think the fire alarm was triggered. I'm not 100% sure of that. I do know that they called 911 because of the problems, but I'll get into it a little bit later about what happened with the fire alarm system. These are photographs of the of columns, and like I said, they found that the columns probably did not have sufficient rebar, especially in the pool deck connections. We can also see some corrosion in the columns and at the foundation. And this is obviously this is on the water. It's a salty environment. There's also the pool was leaking, which is a very significant problem, and it was leaking for years and years and years. So next slide. This is a blueprint of the actual planter when they decided to put the planters on, and you can see the location of these planters, and they were actually like full-grown palm trees placed in these planters, and you can imagine the amount of weight that was placed on the slab with a full-size planter and a giant palm tree. These were removed later on, but for quite a few years, these planters were on the pool deck, and you can see and where the mechanism of the failure occurred, where a large significant portion of the weight was placed was right in that area where the collapse of the slab occurred. Next slide, please. This is a picture of the pool deck before the collapse. This is interesting because there was a report done in 2018. This report indicated that there were problems with the pool leaking and that there was corrosion and that there needed to be repairs done to the building to take care of the corrosion, but there was no indication of any imminent failure of the building. And there was no, there were some interesting things that happened, and I think significant things that happened in the year before. So if you look at this picture in the bottom left, is April 2020, you can see the garage planter, where the garage planter and the beam are located. And you can see that there's no cracking in the top photograph. But if you go to the June 2021, which is literally, this is probably weeks before the collapse, you can see that there's a huge vertical crack in the planter, and that it's, that's not just a small structural crack. I mean, that's a big problem right there. That to me, in June 2021, that would be for me a big problem, and an indication of something seriously wrong going on. And that was not there in 2020. So this is an interesting photo from that. This is taken by, I think, like a landscaper or somebody who was at the project and just happened to take these photographs. Next photograph, or next slide. I talked about where the mechanism was. I guess there were some pool drains that were added in 1996. And we talked about the distress we showed in where the A is in the circle. That's where the planter was, where that you saw the significant cracking. Next slide, please. They cleared out the debris, and this is sort of what was left of the garage level, and you can see essentially where things were. Next slide. Again, this is just sort of telling you where the columns were before they removed them during the demolition. Next slide, please. These are some photographs of the column rebar. You can see that was after the columns were removed, and eventually there was a finding that a lot of the rebar was not adequate, even based on the code in 1980. Next slide, please. So I talked a little bit about these issues that they were looking at, and I think that the report sort of gets to the final conclusions much faster than sort of talking about these hypotheses. But the next door building was 87 Park Tower, and the reason why I bring it up is you'll see in the next slides basically what the outcome was in terms of the litigation. So next slide, please. This was part of the Morabito consultants report in 2018. They showed some indications of spalling columns. There were significant, there was some corrosion you can see in the ceilings, but this is not, to me, this was not an indication of some imminent collapse or any problems that would have indicated that the building was going to collapse. And so this report, while it does indicate there's some serious issues, there's also there's no indication of an imminent collapse. And as we know, the collapse did not occur for another 3 years. So let's go to the next slide. This is looking at the pool deck and seeing where the column is, M11.1. We can go to the next slide. These were photographs taken before the collapse, showing some spalling under some of the decks on the building and some more spalling concrete. We can go to the next slide. This was one of the most horrific disasters that's ever occurred in the United States. The other sort of 3 or 4 major collapses. There was the I think the 1922 Knickerbocker Theater in Washington D.C. collapsed. Killed 98 and injured 133. That was probably the most horrible collapse that we had. These disasters, you have to understand, when you have a disaster, a lot of times reason and the whole litigation process sort of gets thrown out the door. And I think in this case, this is what happened for a lot of people who were involved in the litigation. That it was basically a situation where anyone who touched the building, looked at the building, walked by the building, potentially thought they might have been the cause of the collapse. They ended up being dragged into litigation, even though if they were able to litigate the whole thing, they may not have been found to have been responsible at all for any of the issues that caused this collapse. And the final report actually indicated that the collapse was a result of initially the design of the building was just inadequate. And then over time, the corrosion from the pool, the added weight, those things were found to be the most significant causes of the incident. But can we go to the next slide? This is basically a list of the parties in the litigation, and I only show this not to say that these people deserve to have been brought into a lawsuit and end up paying settlements. I mean, I think a lot of them should not have been brought in, and I don't think a lot of them would have been found responsible for the collapse. I especially don't think that the Champlain Towers consultant, I don't believe that Morabito consultants who did the report in 2018 should have been found responsible, because they did their duty. They provided a report. They indicated the problems, and there was no belief of any imminent collapse, which I think is the standard. The most painful part of this litigation was that the developers of the next door project ended up all being brought in, and all of their consultants, including the architect, the geotech engineer, the structural engineer, anyone who did anything related to the installation of sheet piles got brought into the litigation, and they ended up paying the most of any of the design consultants on this project. And I don't believe that, the reports never found that that was the mechanism of the collapse, that the vibrations were the cause. And so that was another very unfair part of this litigation. We can go to the next slide, which I'll break out what ended up being. These are all public information, but the settlement occurred 1 year exactly after the collapse. And the judge, from my understanding, was very political and wanted to make sure that this case was settled fast and that the people who were injured got their money quickly. And so there was a lot of pressure to get this case settled within 1 year. I'm not even sure if there was any depositions taken or any major discovery occurred in that 1 year. But basically, they were able to settle the case for $1 billion. And the most significant settlements were paid by the security defendant, the security guard, or the security company. They paid $500 million of $1 billion settlement. The developer next door and their consultants combined for $400 million of the $1 billion settlement. Okay, because of some, the allegation or theory that the vibrations from the sheet pile may have accelerated the collapse. The other parties who ended up paying sort of the remainder of the $100 million, the Champlain Towers South ended up paying $55 million. The law firm for the Champlain Towers paid $31 million. And unfortunately, Morabito Consultants paid $16 million. Again, I don't believe that they should have been considered the responsible party, but because of the litigation, they ended up being, placed into the category of a defendant. And ultimately, because of the litigation process, they were all almost forced into paying settlements that were all equal to mostly their policy limits. And this gets into the problem of bad faith litigation in various states, and the fact that when there's a demand for limits, in a case like this, a lot of times the insurance companies are sort of forced into a position where they have to pay these limits in order to avoid potentially extra contractual exposure beyond the limits of the policies. And that's the unfortunate part about these kind of disasters, is that there's so much political pressure, there's so much pressure from all different sides, the attorneys, and then there's also pressure from just to get the litigation to be settled and done with. That people get put into these awful positions and have to end up paying significant amount. The security guard on duty that night, and the reason why they ended up, I think, paying the most, it was basically they called 911 10 minutes before the collapse. When the residents came down, there was a fire alarm system that was installed, which actually had a PA system. And so the person at the security guard desk could have contacted, using their voice, every unit in the building to tell them that they need to leave the building. But the security guard manager admitted that they had not been trained to use the system, or even know that the system existed to help the residents evacuate. And for that reason, because there was a good 10 minutes, the primary sort of defendant that ended up paying in this case was the security defendants, paid $500 million. And so that's why I'm wondering if their fire alarm system was triggered, and because it may have been triggered, but then the person who was using or was at the security desk did not know how to use the PA system for the security alarm system, which is the most unfortunate part of this story. Next slide. So why was there no claims against the original design and construction team? In Florida, there was a 10-year statute of repose, which is different than the statute of limitations. And I'll quickly just say that a statute of repose basically is a statute where you cannot be sued after 10 years, no matter what. It's basically, like in most cases, it's a latent defect statute. So even if it's a latent defect, you can't be sued after 10 years. So, for example, you could have a defect that shows up 4 years later, or shows up at 1 year. 4 years later, you have to file a lawsuit to avoid the statute of limitations. But if the 10-year statute of repose has actually expired before the 4 years, then the statute of repose will essentially trump the statute of limitations. And therefore, in this case in Florida, for example, they could not bring in the original designers, who actually were found to have under-designed the slab for this pool deck. Other changes in Florida, when I presented this in front of the AIA National last year, there was some actual people from Florida. One was a building inspector, and he came up to me afterwards and talked to me about the changes, and they're actually implementing quite a few changes. This 40-year recertification, they're talking about 20-year certifications if you are on the coast, because of the potential of salt and accelerating the corrosion. And one of the other big problems was that the condo associations were sort of dealing with raising the funds to perform the maintenance and the repairs, and they were having a very difficult time getting the association members to pay the extra money. And so there was quite a long delay in actually getting the repairs done, even though there was reports 2 or 3 years before, indicating that they need to do repairs and do it quickly to avoid further corrosion of the building. Next slide. I only bring this slide up because in California we actually have a similar statute of repose, but the strange thing about our statute of repose in California is that it doesn't necessarily bar personal injury lawsuits. So there could be an argument that if this occurred in California, that some of the original designers may have been, brought back in or brought into the litigation. And there's also indications in some states where you have collapses where the legislature will sort of go back and say, for certain types of structures or certain bridges or something like that, we'll change the statute so we can bring in these companies that designed these inadequate buildings 40 years ago. So there's quite a few crazy things that can happen, but that's just something to keep in mind. Next slide. So I talked a little bit about the changes. They have implemented quite a few changes, and those changes seem to be working for them. There hasn't obviously been any other collapses. They actually, I think they shut down 2 or 3 other buildings within 30 days of this collapse because they found they were having problems with the building itself. And so the collapse, unfortunately, or if there's any fortunate part, it did raise the awareness, and there were quite a few changes that were made to the codes and to inspections and certifications in Florida and elsewhere. Next slide. I think we talked about this, so next slide, please. And next slide. I think I sort of summarized these findings, so I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but I think the problem was the original design work for the pool deck slab was just completely inadequate. But despite the fact that it was inadequate and not code, the building stood for 40 years. And even after placing things like the planters on it, which were not accounted for in the original design, the pool collapse didn't occur. I mean, the slab did not collapse until, again, 40 years after it was built. And you can say the vibrations next door, or you can say the corrosion from the pool leaking, and all these things sort of added and compounded for the final collapse of this building. But these types of disasters, it's really hard to kind of come back and figure out what really happened there, and why did this building collapse at that time or in that day, and the building built a year later exactly the same or similar, still standing today with no other problems with it. So anyway, it's just an interesting project to look at, look back on, and if there's any lessons to be learned, there are a few lessons, I'd say. We can talk about that. Next slide. I'd say, this sounds insane, but because of collapses like this, you sort of think about things like, a building you did or you worked on, and what happens if this happens, and so you have to start preparing yourself, I guess, in some degree, for a potential crisis. What do you need to do? How are you going to handle it? What are you going to do if it happens? So I think that's just something to think about and keep in mind. I think if you're doing evaluations of buildings or structures, just be very specific and clear on what you're looking at and what you're not evaluating. In this case, people did not look at the original design. If they looked at the original design, they may have come up with the fact that the design was inadequate for the pool slab. I think that the next one is to be specific on what you did not evaluate and what that means. So for example, you're not doing invasive testing. You're not going and doing x-rays of the rebar to analyze the rebar. You're not determining whether the rebar, how corroded the rebar was. You can only see the rebar that's got spalling, where concrete spalled. You can only see rust stains. You can only see so much. So just being very specific about what you did see, what you did not see, and what you can evaluate. Oh, and then if you are, say, working on a project and you see a contractor performing the construction where it didn't meet the specifications, you got to make sure you ring the bell loudly and just make sure that they're aware of it, because this is an instance where you go back in history and you say, oh, I looked at this, I took a picture of this, but I didn't say anything, and then that ends up being the collapse, or that becomes a problem. Then you're going to be the one that's going to be looked at the most in that situation, because you were asked to perform those reviews and observations at the time. So I think that's it, and we have some time for questions. Next slide. Yes, if we have any.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce. Great job. Very fascinating topic. Let's see here. We've got a question from Andres. He said, I thought it was 7 years now for the statute of limitations.
Well, it depends on your state. So I'm not trying to say that 10 years is the statute for a repose for every state. There's some states that are 7. There's some states that are more, some less. California is 10 for statute of repose, 4 years for a patent defect, and 3 years if you are aware of a problem. So 2 years for personal injury in California. So I don't know what state this person is from, but it may be 7 years in that state.
Okay, next question is from Maria. Was the penthouse added after the original construction?
Yes, that's it was added, and it was an issue because it sort of violated the height restrictions, or it was something that sort of was problematic because it did increase. It may have increased the height of the building, livable space of the building. So I think that it was an issue, and it may have added weight. It may have been, one of the situations where it ended up adding weight to the building, because I don't believe there's a penthouse on the other north building.
Interesting. Let's see here. Anthony asks, were the designers different for the 2 towers?
No, they were. I believe they're the same.
Okay, then we got a question from Rosanna. She actually has 2. I'll try to combine them. Has it been determined that the slab design of the sister building is adequate? And how can we assure that the sister building is not at risk?
Yeah, I don't know if they actually analyzed the adequacy of the sister building's slab. I do know from what I've read that they did do a very thorough inspection of that building and determined that it was structurally sound, and that people could live in the building, and it didn't have the same types of problems that the Champlain Towers South building had. So, but as I mentioned, if the design of the slab was inadequate, I mean, it's very possible, or potentially, possible that the columns and the rebar and the columns for the Champlain Towers North has the same problem. But I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
That I have a question there. So what's the city's responsibility? Are they ever inspecting these buildings? And I noticed in the lineup of sort of payees or people that paid into this large settlement, that there was no responsibility there for the city.
Yeah, so cities generally have an immunity, which is kind of terrible. I mean, you have a city responsible for inspections, building inspectors. They're the ones that are supposed to review the drawings and approve the drawings for construction, saying that they meet the code or don't meet the code, and yet they have an immunity. I think that there are situations where that immunity is lost, where there's intentional fraud or some sort of grift or something going on. You can get around the immunity. One interesting note, though, on that is that, notwithstanding the fact that Surfside was not sued or brought into the case, they contributed $1 million, I understand, towards this settlement. And a lot of the parties actually, there were a lot of companies who contributed money who were actually not named as parties. If you look at the actual pleadings, there was 2 or 3 amendments to the complaint. The complaint, by the way, was filed. The first complaint was filed the day after the collapse for $5 million by one of the residents. It was the series of other complaints were filed subsequently, but a lot of the parties that paid money actually, some were not even defendants in the litigation, and they contributed. The building was, I think that the site was sold to a Dubai real estate investment company for $120 million, although it was valued at $83 million. And so each resident received the value of their condo, or their estate received the value of the condo, which was determined to be 83 million. Probably ended up getting potentially more. And the remainder of the, I guess, $900+ million was distributed to the 98 people, to the estates for the 98 people who passed away, and then also those who were injured.
It's a great segue into the next question. So Scott asks, will the full $1 billion ever be paid? Doubtful the security contractor had $500 million of insurance, as well as the others.
They all paid because they all had insurance. So that's why you get insurance. I don't believe, I'm not sure if there was much money paid out of pocket. There's probably potentially deductibles or self-retention, parts of the policy, but most of the, if you look at the numbers, most of the numbers were very like 0, 0, 0, 0. It was like 500 million, 400 million, 10 million, 15 million, 20 million. There was not a lot of like, $4,999, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and here's another great question by Brent. Was the condo association ever found liable for failure to address maintenance items?
Yeah, I think I said in the settlement that they ended up paying 31 million or 50 million. It was the law firm paid 31 million, I think, but the condo association itself paid, I think, good like 50 million.
Okay, let's see here. We got another minute or so here. Were the developers, this is from Jonathan, were the developers of the north and south buildings the same?
Yes. And there's some, if you look in the history of the buildings, there was some graft kind of going on. They think that there's also a possibility that the construction materials were like, not very good. And there was like, there was some shady stuff going on with the developers. You can look at the history. You go on Wikipedia, actually, they have some of the sort of shady history of the developer. I don't know what happened to them. They may have, something bad may have happened to them. I don't know, but there was a lot of discussion about the sort of shadiness of the whole project and the developers.
Yeah, I remember reading an article in the Miami Herald about the development of these towers, and there seemed to be some corruption and some pay-to-play type situations going on there. So
yeah, like how they got the permits through the building and how they got it through permitting and those kinds of things, I think it was a little shady.
Okay, and there's a bunch of different questions here, so I'm going to finish with one last one, and then the other ones we will be sure to email you back if you ask the question. So how definite is that the failed column M11-1 is actually what is shown in that photo? It looks odd that it would be able to fall over almost intact versus buckling and remaining connected at its top and bottom. And that's a question from John B.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the column does look like it may have broken into pieces. That the video was actually taken like 7 minutes before the collapse. And that's the only column that looks like it did collapse in that photograph or the video. So I think they're pretty certain that that's the first column that did collapse. And the corrosion of the rebar in that area was fairly significant. You couldn't see it from below, but inside the slab, the corrosion was fairly significant, and the rebar connecting that column to the slab may have disintegrated in that area. So I think they're pretty certain that that is where the first column collapsed.
Great. Well, once again, thank you everyone for spending their time with us. Special thanks to Bruce. Great presentation. Appreciate you taking the time and putting this together for us. If you have any further questions, please reach out to either Bruce or myself. We'd be happy to answer them. If you need your certificate of attendance, please email Liz Seaman. Her email address is there. Again, we did record this webinar, and anybody that registered or attended will be provided with a link to the recording. And once again, thank you, Bruce, and thank you everyone for your time. Appreciate it. Have a good one.
Thank you.